Hi, Dave Youngquist, Michigan Toy Soldier. Today, I wanted to welcome you, number one, to our new set. This is the Michigan Toy Soldier Reference Library. And I've had lots and lots of requests on how to paint eyes. Now, we briefly covered it in the, the 9-part series of the Red Baron, but I'm going to try to make this one even simpler, and we're going to be using some large diagrams to illustrate what it is that I'm doing. Let's get started. Okay, I've selected a large-scale bust from Michael Roberts to illustrate how to paint eyes. Again, we've had lots of requests for this. So the first step in painting eyes is to remember, don't paint the base part of the eyes white. It'll give it a real pop-eyed look. And it's not very realistic. So what I typically do, especially in a large-scale figure, or let's say even going down to a 54 millimeter, is you want to get a nice mix of a ivory and a flesh color. It's going to look much more natural. So the first step is to apply 2 thin coats of paint to the eye socket, and you're going to let that dry for just a minute or so. I already applied 1 coat, so didn't have to waste your time. Then the next step is painting in the iris. Now, when painting an iris, there's a number of different techniques you can use. The one I'm going to show up here illustrated is the old Chet Pain method, where if you have difficulties centering the eye, you can actually paint stripes down it. In the smaller scale figures, you can really go to the darker colors, dark blues, blacks, what have you. In a larger scale figure, you really want to paint the black in there first, and then we'll go in with different colors of blues and highlights, what have you. On very small scale figures, you can actually use a toothpick, shave it down, to paint the pupil. Let me show you how that's done. On this particular figure, we're going to use a bit of an Andrea Black acrylic, and we're going to lay in the iris. Now, because I'm right-handed, sometimes it's easier to flip the figure upside down to do the right eye, because you'll find that the nose gets in the way. The important part here is that you keep both the irises in the same direction. That's why using stripes down the eyes, sometimes if you're having trouble with that, is simpler. After you get some practice, you probably won't have to use that particular method. Let's go to the next step. Okay. Now that the iris, which we painted black, has dried, we need to put in the center color. On this particular figure, I'm going to be using a Vallejo Prussian blue. Give that a good shake. And we're going to leave just a small circular band of black. You'll see on the illustration that when you're painting the eyes, you don't want to float a circle inside of the eye. You do want the eye to cover a good portion of the iris. Now again, at this step, if you're getting the paint above and below, let's say the lids, that's okay. Let's add the blue, because we're going to come back and we're going to clean all that up in a minute. It's what we call cutting back. Again, following the same method, but start from the center and work out, and again, try to leave that black ring if at all possible. Again, if you have to touch it up, that's okay. And we flip it over, make it easier. Let that dry for a minute. Let's go to the next step. Okay, now that we've got the blue inside the iris, the next step is to paint the pupil. Now we're going to go back to our black, and we're going to dot that in the center of the iris. Again, if you're a shaky Jake, not a problem. Use a toothpick. Otherwise, use a really good quality brush. Right now I'm using a Da Vinci Series 3620. And get a little bit of water. Now be careful here. If you add a little too much water, you're going to get some running, and you don't want to obscure all the hard work you've done so far. But these brushes have such a great point, I can go right in there with a dot on each pupil. We let that dry for a minute. Now, the next step that I like to do is begin to cut back the upper eyelid. I do that because, you know, we've got some of the our first mix, our ivory and flesh color, it's slopped over at the top a little bit, and I've got some of the blue and the black up in the upper eyelid. So now we're going to take some Vallejo mahogany brown, or any good quality red brown, and we want to cut in the upper eyelid, which you'll be able to see on the diagram. And in this figure, it's so well sculpted, it's making it very, very easy. This one, we'll do the same thing, flip them over. Cleans it right up. Then, finally, I'm going to take a dot. Again, you can do this with a toothpick, you know, if you prefer, or I'm going to be using ivory paint. And we're going to put the catch light in. The catch light, which you will see, is a reflection that is really going to make the eyes look very, very lifelike. Make sure they're in the exact same spot on both eyes. There we go. Let's go to the next step. The final step in painting the eyes, well, two final steps actually, is that we need to paint in the lower eyelid, and for that I use a straight flesh color because I've seen lots of guys and they'll put a dark shadow on the top like we did with the mahogany brown on the top eyelid, but also darken the lower eyelid, which actually is very inaccurate. The lower eyelid is actually an area of highlights, so we're going to use a straight flesh color and reduce the eye once again and clean up, you know, some of the excess paint that we've put everywhere. I got that, a little more paint on the other side. A little more water. Again, keep the paint thin but not runny. There. Now, for a little more contrast, and if you are painting in a larger scale figure, you could take some of your blue, mix it with a bit of the flesh, and around the pupil, you can just lightly dot the pupil just to give it a little more, now what's the best word, a little more contrast, a little more punch. Smaller scale figures, it's very difficult to do and probably won't be seen by anybody anyways. But on a large scale figure, it's definitely a technique you might want to try and experiment with. And the same is true with brown eyes. You know, if you're painting the eyes a brown, you could go in there, just add a little bit of flesh to the mix and, you know, stipple it in there to give that appearance. You know how the eyes have that kind of a sunburst type of effect. I think that's the word I was looking for. As a final step, I quite often, especially on larger figures, to add a filter. Now, what I mean by a filter is that on a larger figure, I like to add a real tiny amount of Vallejo dark red into the tear duct area, but keep it really, really super thin, you know, just like a wash. And you could just wash a bit of that in there, and if you get a little bit too much, just brush it back out. So that's one really neat technique. Another is take some Vallejo smoke and thin it out, again dramatically. This is going to give kind of a nice smoky feel to the eye. And you could literally just brush that right over, and it's going to leave a bit of a satin finish, and it's just going to tone it down just slightly, so you might want to experiment with that. And then finally, I would use a bit of a gloss varnish. In this case, again, I'm using Vallejo to really give that eye a bit of sparkle. Try those techniques. Anyways, I hope this has been helpful. If there are further questions, don't hesitate to call me at the shop or send me an email. This has been Dave Youngquist, Michigan Toy Soldier on YouTube.